So here I've got the water pump assembly for the 83 Yamaha Venture. I'm doing a rebuild and I've got it all cleaned up, new parts. I'm ready to install the mechanical seal on the water side of the pump, which has to get pressed into the opening right here. This is the mechanical seal, spring-loaded, so you can't press down on it from here. You really got to get something that'll fit over top of that and press down on the lip to compress it down in and press it down in there. So I'm using my neighbor's 1 1/16 impact driver socket, which will actually sit right down over top of that. So the concept is set it all in here, get it positioned nice and flat and straight, which is the tricky part, and then insert the bolt through the bottom, put the nut and the washers on top, crank it down, and then start tightening it in order to press it down in there flat and straight. So that's my plan. Let me get it set up here. And for that, you're supposed to put some Yamaha number 4 inside the inner edge. And then also it says to put some grease on the lip of the mechanical seal. So I'm going to put a little on there. It doesn't say anything about greasing it so that it slides down in any easier, so not going to do that. So we'll see what happens. So I really couldn't work the camera while I was tightening it down, but basically this is what it looks like after it was done. You notice that I did have the water pump mounted to a board with a thin piece of cereal box cardboard in between, just to protect the surface on the other side of the water pump. Had it clamped to my workmate, just ran the bolt up through the middle, put down the Yamalube, or the Yamabond 4, put a little grease on the lip, set it on top, put the socket on top of that, ran the bolt up through it, snugged it up, checked it, made sure it was seated, looked level as I could. It's kind of hard to look down in there. Obviously now you can't see any of it, but you could just see a little bit of the mechanical seal once you got that on there. So then I just started tightening it up and cranked it down, and it went down pretty easily. Well, it took some effort, but I mean, it was tight, but went down and seated, and it wouldn't tighten anymore, so you know it's all the way down at that point. So I'll take it apart and see what it looks like from both sides of the water pump, and hopefully that'll do it. Then it'll be a matter of just installing the seal and the bearing on the other side, then insert the impeller, put the circlips back on, and the drive gear on the other side, and the circlip on top of that, and then it's ready to be put back on the bike. So here it is after removing all the socket and the bolt and all that stuff, and it looks like it's seated pretty well all the way around. Little hair line of grease on the edge. I did notice when I first took it off that it looked like this one edge over here had just almost enough room to run a fingernail through. So I put everything back together and I retightened it, and then I loosened it, turned the socket about 120 degrees, did that 3 times, retightened it each time. And that did seem to push it down just a little more. So some unevenness in the way the socket was sitting on it may have left one edge up just a hair, and so just to compensate for that, I retightened it after moving the socket around 2 or 3 times. So that part's done. We'll move on to getting the oil seal and the bearing in place on the other side. One thing the book does warn you about, the manual, is do not scratch the surface of the mechanical seal. And that is this little ring right around the outside, around the face of it on the inside. That's what matches up, lines up, and mates up to the corresponding piece on the impeller. There's a seal on the inside of the impeller, and that's a little, they call it a ceramic. I don't know if it's ceramic or if it's some sort of composite material now, but that's what has to be perfectly scratch-free and all that in order to maintain the seal. So obviously when I turn this thing over and start messing with the other side, you got to protect this side as well. So here we are with the pump removed from the board, flipped over. This is the oil seal for the bearing, and the book says that the numbers printed on the one side of the seal are supposed to go against the mechanical seal side, so actually it gets flipped over this way, which, as I recall, my apologies, technology once again ran out of space on the camera. So as I was saying, you insert it with the numbers down, basically facing the opposite side, the mechanical seal side. And it just slips into the opening and just sits there until you put the bearing in place. One thing I did notice, or meant to mention, after I flipped it over, I did check inside and make sure the weep hole was not clogged with the Yamaha 4. You can see through the from the hole from the outside to make sure it's clear. I did kind of clean it out with a pick just to make sure there wasn't a bunch of stuff stuck in it, because you need that as your safety valve. If something gets beyond either one of these seals, it's supposed to go out through that weep hole. So I did do that. So the next step is to put the bearing in, and as I recall, the bearing probably doesn't make a difference, but the bearing, when I pulled it out, had the imprints around the outer race on the outside, so that's the way the new one is going in. So to get that in there, didn't go in quite as easily as I thought it might, but it is a fairly tight fit, and it doesn't go down all the way. The proof will be in when the impeller is mounted in through there, if the slot for the circlip lines up properly. But the way I got that in there, I considered using a smaller rod and doing the reverse of what I did for the seal, but considering these things are pretty hefty, I thought it might be easier just to tap it in. So I took the old bearing, set it on top, set one of these big washers on it, took the impact socket again, set that on top of that, and then just kind of hammered it down, pounding around in a circle, making sure, watching it from down here, that it stayed relatively even all the way around as it was going in. It did go in a little whopper jawed to start with, but was able to straighten it out and didn't take a lot of pressure. Again, making sure that the other side was not sitting on top of something hard, so as to risk scratching that other mechanical seal surface. So anyway, we have a bearing, the seal's in place. Got to check and see if there's any time requirement as far as the Yamaha 4 before we can put it all back on the bike with the, well, I got to put the impeller and all that stuff on, so that's next. So this is the old impeller. This had the original plastic impeller that the bikes were originally made with, and surprisingly it's not in too bad a shape. I don't see any problems with it. Some of them I've read where, you know, they're cracked and coming apart, and I guess there is a crack right there right on that side. But as far as I know, it was still cooling reasonably well and all that. The problem was the leaking through the weep hole. So anyway, that's the old one. The new one, the mechanical seal came as a set, so this piece with the white insert was a separate washer that came, or seal that came with the other mechanical seal. You just put a little antifreeze on it, just slide it down the shaft and just kind of push it in place with your fingers. I know the manual talks about leveling it, making sure it's perfectly level. I think those were the old style. Hopefully, I mean, this one looks as level as I can tell, and it's down as far as it needed to go, so I'm hoping that's satisfactory. If I'm mistaken, I guess I'll find out once it's all back together. So here we are back again after plugging the phone in, and as I inserted the impeller, which you put a little bit of grease on the shaft and just kind of slide it through, it pops in through the seal over each of the indentations for the circlip. And I did find that once I got it in there that the bearing was not seated quite far enough because the indentation for the circlip was not exposed. So I had to pull it apart, or pull the shaft back out, which just kind of twists back out. Put the socket and the washers and the old bearing on top of the new bearing, and just kind of tapped it a little more, and it did, with just some light tapping, did go down a little further. As you can see, there's not a lot. There is a bit of a lip there, but not much. But here you can see the circlip is now installed. I'm ready to put the pin back in, followed by the gear and the last circlip. And here we have the reinstalled impeller with the gear, circlips installed, and it rotates nice and smoothly. Other side, there we are, ready for installation. The kit did come with a new compression ring for the drain plug, so I will pry that off of there. Put the new compression ring on and new gasket, and then begin the installation back onto the bike. And then the test. Ta-da! Thanks. The bearing in place.